Hello, everyone. Mr. Eford here. I hope that you guys are doing well. We're going to get started today with another video lesson about ancient Israel. And today we're going to talk about the growth and spread of Judaism, which is the religious belief system, their religious views throughout the world. Before we get started, I do need to own up to a mistake that I made in the last video, and I want to go ahead and rectify that before we get into the next video. In the last video at the end, I told you that the end of the Jewish captivity in Babylon, their Babylonian exile, that the Persian king Darius let the Jews go. That's actually incorrect. The Persian king who ended the Jewish exile in Babylon was actually Cyrus the Great, who was the leader of Persia at the time when the Persians came in and conquered the Chaldeans. So in case you went out and did a little bit of research and you're like, oh, Mr. Eford's wrong, it does happen occasionally. But I wanted to correct that. I wanted to make sure that you guys knew that Cyrus the Great was the one who actually released the Jews from captivity and not Darius. Now, Darius is an important king, and we're going to talk about him a little bit later on. He comes into the picture during the story of Daniel, and we'll talk about Daniel a little bit today as a prophet during the time of Egyptian captivity in Babylon. So now that I've got my apology and my correction out of the way, we're going to get started with our notes today. This is a really lengthy lesson, okay? And I've gone through it and I've looked at it and I've tried to look at some good break points where we could maybe stop this lesson and then pick up a little bit later on. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to get maybe a little bit short of halfway through this to a good stopping point. And we're going to continue the lesson on another day. So in a moment, when we look at the timeline, we're really only going to cover one of the three events on the timeline today in class. And then later on, we'll cover the remaining stuff. So again, I didn't want a lesson to last over 40 minutes on the video. And that's probably what's going to happen if we try to go through the entire lesson in one sitting. And I don't think that that's a good thing for you or for me as a teacher right now to try to go through that much information at one time. With that being said, you do have a note sheet attached, but the note sheet is only going to cover about half the notes. So cover what you can, leave the rest of it until we complete the lesson at a later date, okay? With that being said, and with us having a lot of information to cover, we're going to go ahead and get started with our lesson today. The first slide simply says the growth of Judaism, and you can't see the information on the timeline, so I'm just going to break it up for you right quick. The first thing that we're going to cover is what I told you in the introduction. Cyrus is going to release the Jews from captivity in Babylon. They get to go back home to Jerusalem, rebuild their temple, rebuild their walls, go back to living their culture, the life that they had lived before Babylonian captivity. The second thing on the timeline is about 168 BC, a man by the name of Judas Maccabeus leads a rebellion against Antiochus, okay? And we're going to talk about the Maccabeans tomorrow or in a later lesson. So we're not going to get to them today, but the Maccabeans were an important group during this time period. And then lastly, around AD 100, so this is after the break in the timeline, around AD 100, we see the Jews revolt against Roman leadership in the Roman Empire. And this is going to lead to the utter fall of Jerusalem. And we'll see that take place at a later time. Okay. So again, we won't get to that in today's lesson, but we will get there eventually. Okay. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and get started with the time period of the Babylonian captivity, which is where we left off in the last set of notes that we had. All right. Exile and return. The Jews continued to practice their religion during their exile in Babylon. That's the header for this section of the notes. The Jews call their time in Babylon an exile. Now, that simply means that they were forced to live in another land. This is not their home. This is not the area where they are citizens. This is a distant land. They're forced to live there. And so while in Babylon, while in exile, Jews continued to practice their religion, and they adopted the name Judaism, right? Remember that Judaism comes from Judah, the land that they were conquered and taken from. So they adopt the name Judaism during this time period as they practice their faith. They continued to worship God even while they were in exile. All right, while in Babylon, small groups of Jews met on the Sabbath day. This was their holy day, their day of worship. This was the weekly day of worship and rest. In today's week, Saturday would have been that day. While most people worship on Sunday now, Sabbath day was actually held on Saturday during this time period. Okay, this is their weekly day of worship and rest. The Jewish Sabbath goes from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. The weekly meetings took place in a place called synagogues, which was a Jewish house of worship. The synagogue meetings gave the people hope. Okay, the prophets had said before the exile took place, one day we'll get to go back. And so as they met, they would talk about these prophecies, and it gave them hope that one day their captivity would end, they would get to go home, they would get to go back to Jerusalem. All right, so why did the Jews return to the land of Judah? During the 500 BCs, a group of people called the Persians swept across the southwest of Asia. They defeated the Chaldeans. They took over Babylon. In the year 538 BC, the Persian king Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Judah. He gave them permission to go back. Some of the Jews stayed in Babylon, but many of them went home. They rebuilt Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple. Cyrus appointed officials to rule the country and to collect taxes from the people. So they're still part of the Persian Empire. They still have to pay their taxes to the king, but he's allowing them to go home. Okay. The Persians did not allow the Jews to have their own government or their own king. So the Jews depended mainly on their religious leaders. These were the temple priests and scribes to help run their society. Many of the scribes became religious scholars. Under one of the scribes named Ezra, the Jews wrote 5 books of the Torah on pieces of parchment. They sewed the pieces together to make long scrolls. The Torah and these writings were later added to make up the Hebrew Bible, which again we said is mostly the Old Testament of the Christian Bible with the addition of some other documents as well. All right, so what all is in the Hebrew Bible? It's made up of a series of 34 books that are all collected together. The Torah, which is the first 5 books, the prophets, the writings that were added later make up the Hebrew Bible. Some of these books described events in Jewish history. Others are books of poetry, like the book of Psalms and Proverbs. Literature, Proverbs, those are wise sayings. These make up the Hebrew Bible. For example, Genesis, which is the first book of the Torah, tells how God created the earth in 6 days and rested on the 7th day. He also created the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. Genesis also tells how God punished the world for its bad behavior. In Genesis, God tells a man named Noah to build an ark, or a large boat. Noah and his family and 2 of every kind of animal on earth boarded the ark. Then a great flood covered the land, and only the ones who were on the ark, the animals and the humans who were on the ark, escaped from drowning. After the flood, God promised to never again destroy the world with a flood. And of course, the symbol of the rainbow is the symbol of that promise from God that he would never destroy the world using water, using a flood again. Genesis also explains why the world has so many different languages. It tells how the people in the city of Babel tried to build a tower to heaven. God disapproved of this. He thought that people were acting too high and mighty for their own good, that they wanted to be able to reach heaven on their own. That was something humans were not supposed to be able to do. So God made the people speak in different languages to babble to one another. That's where the word Babel comes from. And then they scattered across the earth because they couldn't communicate with each other. And if you've ever been in a situation where you're talking to someone else and you're both speaking different languages, you know how frustrating it can be to try to make yourself understood when you're speaking a different language than the other person. And usually that frustration is returned and mimicked by the other person as well, because you just can't understand each other. That's what happens with the the Tower of Babel, which we think today is where the city of Babylon at one point was. And the word Babel, Babylon, it all kind of goes together. All right, the Jews look to the future. Parts of the Hebrew Bible describe God's plan for a peaceful future. The book of Daniel addresses this issue. Daniel lived in Babylon during the time of exile. He was a trusted advisor of the king. However, Daniel refused to worship the Babylonian gods. The Chaldeans threw Daniel into a lion's den. This is all because of a really bad promise or a bad plan that they had initiated with King Darius. Darius is the king of Babylon at the time. Daniel is one of his chief advisors. And these other advisors had grown jealous of him. They didn't like Daniel. They didn't like that the king trusted him so much. And he was so high up in the political standings of Babylon. And so these other advisors went to King Darius and they said, Darius, you're such an amazing guy. They buttered him up. They kind of fed into his ego. They said, you're such an amazing guy that no one should worship anyone except for you. So you should make it a law that for the next several weeks, that the only person that the people can pray to is you, their king. And Darius liked it. His ego was stoked. He said, "You know what? That sounds great. We'll make it a law." And so these advisors made the law, knowing that Daniel would not follow it, that he would continue praying to his God. And so when Daniel was caught the next day praying by an open window to his God, he was arrested and taken to Darius. And the people said, "King, this man blatantly defies your decree. He will not pray to you. He prays only to his God." And Darius was sad because he liked Daniel. He knew that Daniel was a good advisor and a good leader, but he had to follow his law. And so, as a result of Daniel refusing to worship Darius, he's thrown into a den of hungry lions. Okay, and he's left there overnight. But God protected Daniel from the lions. The story was meant to remind the Jews that God would rescue them, even in times of great danger. Darius goes to the lion's den the next morning and he yells, "Daniel, are you okay? Did you survive?" And Daniel answers him and he says, "I'm fine, King. I lived through the night." And the king takes Daniel out of the lion's den and throws those advisors who had tricked him into making this law in the first place into the lion's den, where they're devoured, as the story goes. All right, and of course, this is an image of Daniel in the lion's den, a painting of what an artist thought it may have looked like for Daniel to be praying to his God with the lions surrounding him, but he was protected. The lions didn't touch him, which is a really cool story from Babylonian captivity. The Jews also believed that evil and suffering would eventually be replaced by goodness. Christians and Muslims share this idea of good eventually triumphing over evil, that's maybe not something that will happen now, but at some point in the future, good will win, evil will lose, and the world will be a better place. All right, Jews and the Greeks, we're kind of wrapping up or getting toward the end of our lesson today, and we'll get through the diaspora, which will be the last big thing we talk about, and Greek culture, and we're going to kind of wrap things up for the time being until we can finish this up a little bit later on. But the Jews and the Greeks, Jews spread their beliefs to the Greek world, and they regained control of Judah. This is after the Persian Empire kind of comes and goes, right? 334 BC, a Greek king by the name of Alexander the Great. We're going to talk about Alexander a lot more when we get into Greece. He was an interesting guy, and he accomplished a lot of things during his lifetime. But Alexander the Great began taking over the known world at this point in time, and he expanded his empire bigger than any other of the Greek kings at this point in time. And he expanded his empire around the Mediterranean area, which, of course, included Israel, where it's located. So in 331 BC, his armies defeated the Persians, and Judah came under the control of the Greeks, and specifically under the control of Alexander. Alexander allowed the Jews to stay in Judah. However, Alexander loved all things Greek, and he wanted the rest of the world to love all things Greek as well. He wanted to make the world look as much like Greece as he possibly could. So he introduced the Greek language to the Jews and the Greek ways to the land of Judah. Greece becomes another official language in Judah at this point in time, and people began to convert from writing in the Hebrew language to writing in the Greek language. And we see that carry on through not only this time period, but the time period following as well. All right, so we talk about this period known as the diaspora. That's a really cool word, diaspora. We're going to talk about what it means in just a moment. But at this time, the Jews who were living throughout Alexander's empire, many of them still lived in Babylon. Some of them lived in Egypt. Others lived around the Mediterranean Sea. So in other words, Jewish population is scattered because of Babylon conquering them, the Chaldeans conquering them, the Assyrians scattering them. There are people who practice the Jewish faith living all over the world at this point in time. They're not just living in Jerusalem. So we see here that the scattering of the Jews outside of Israel and Judea became known as the diaspora. Okay, and the word diaspora literally kind of means to disperse. You can hear the similarities between those two words, diaspora and disperse. And if you disperse something, it's like scattering it out. Okay, if you think of a farmer with a bag full of seeds, and he might go through and disperse or diaspora those seeds, he just scatters them out through his field, hoping that his crops will grow. So the word literally means to scatter, and the Jewish people are scattered through the known world at this point in time. Many of the Jews of the diaspora learned the Greek language and Greek ways, but they remained loyal to Judaism. They continued to practice their faith. Even though they spoke a different language, lived in a different land, or even lived under different cultures, they still practiced their beliefs, their religious beliefs. A group of them copied the Hebrew Bible into Greek. Okay, this is important. Now the Hebrew Bible is in another language and can be read by more people in more areas of the world. Remember, Alexander the Great spread the Greek language throughout much of the known world during this time because he was so fascinated with Greek culture and he wanted it to spread. The Greek version of the Bible helped people who were not Jewish to read and understand the Hebrew Bible. As a result, these Jewish ideas spread throughout the Mediterranean world. And this is the diaspora. This is the great dispersal of Jewish ideas throughout the world at this point in time. And I think this may be where we're going to lead off. I'm going to advance to the next screen. Yeah, we're gonna stop here. I don't want to get into the Maccabees until tomorrow. We have a little bit more time to cover it. Hopefully you guys have learned something through today's lesson, talking about the exile, the return from the exile, the introduction of Greek language and ideas, the diaspora, the dispersal of Jewish people and culture and beliefs throughout the known world at this time. We see Judaism grow as a religious belief throughout the world. And that's an important thing. It's going to affect a lot moving forward. So with that being said, we'll pause for the announcement.
Teachers, just a reminder for today, before you leave, make sure all windows and doors are closed, please. Again, make sure all windows and doors are closed and locked.
Will do. All right. So as we leave off, I hope that you guys have learned something from our presentation today, from the lesson. We will continue this lesson later on. We're going to talk about the Maccabees. We're going to talk about the Roman Empire and the final fall of Jerusalem with the Roman Empire and the spread of Judaism even through today's culture. So we've got a lot of stuff left to cover, but I feel like this is a good point where we can kind of leave off and stop for the time being. Hope that you guys have learned something. I look forward to seeing you again soon. Until then, take care.